The Japanese pilots had mocked the F6F Hellcat for months, calling it slow, clumsy, and hopelessly outmatched. But at sunrise on a quiet Pacific morning, everything changed. A single American pilot discovered a strange, unexplained scorch mark on his wing, an odd detail that would reveal a hidden weakness in Japan's most feared Zero formation and turn the entire battle upside down. The first light of morning drifted slowly across the carrier's deck as the crew prepared for another long patrol over the Pacific. The air was still, touched only by the faint scent of fuel and the low hum of machinery warming for flight. Lieutenant Aaron McKinley, a young but steady Hellcat pilot, moved with quiet purpose toward his aircraft. He had flown this routine dozens of times, and nothing about this morning suggested that the hours ahead would become one of the most studied encounters of the air war. But as he walked beneath the broad blue wing of his F6F, he paused. Near the root of the starboard wing, just above the ammunition hatch, a strange burn mark, thin, curved, almost like a crescent, cut across the metal skin. It wasn't from a bullet, nor shrapnel, nor anything his crew chief recognized. The mark shimmered faintly in the rising light, dark at the center and fading outward as if something had grazed the aircraft at extreme speed. McKinley brushed his glove across it. The metal felt warm, though the aircraft had been sitting outside all night. No one could explain it. The maintenance crew insisted it hadn't been there during yesterday's inspection. And yet, the Hellcat had returned from its last mission without McKinley noticing anything unusual. No hits, no close calls, no warnings from his wingman. But the mark bothered him, not because of what it was, but because of what it suggested. Something had passed close enough to his aircraft to scorch metal without leaving debris, vibration, or sound. Something that moved faster than his eyes or instruments could register. A thing that should not have gone unnoticed. As the morning briefing began, news arrived that Japanese pilots were becoming increasingly confident, almost arrogant, in their belief that the Hellcat remained inferior to the Zero. They had been laughing at American pilots for weeks, certain the skies still belonged to them. But McKinley could not shake the feeling that the unknown mark on his wing was connected somehow to a shift he could not yet define. That subtle, unexplained sign, overlooked by everyone else, would soon reveal a hidden pattern in Japanese flight tactics, one that would erupt into a battle so unexpected, so decisive, that would silence the laughter of Japan's ace pilots forever. The hours after dawn unfolded with a quiet steadiness across the carrier's deck, the kind of slow and deliberate rhythm that usually marked the beginning of an uneventful patrol day. Yet beneath that familiar routine lay an undercurrent of unease, one that only a few members of the air group were perceptive enough to sense. Lieutenant Aaron McKinley stood near the wing of his Hellcat, studying the strange crescent-shaped scorch that had appeared overnight, trying to understand how a mark so unusual could have been left on metal without any of the noise or shock associated with combat damage. The carrier drifted gently through calm Pacific swells, its wake forming long, dissolving patterns on the surface, but McKinley's attention remained fixed on the single, inexplicable sign etched into his aircraft's skin. The deck crews moved around him in the slow, practiced choreography that came naturally after months at sea, rolling munitions carts into position, checking radio wires, securing harnesses, and performing the dozens of small tasks that prepared a fighter squadron for flight. None of them seemed troubled by the odd mark. They dismissed it as some minor heat effect from a gun test or a temporary flash from a misaligned exhaust. But McKinley knew his aircraft better than anyone else aboard the ship. He could recall every scratch along its fuselage, every rivet that had ever loosened during a rough landing, and every bullet strike it had received during previous engagements. This was different. The burn had an unnatural smoothness, a perfect arc, almost graceful in shape, and it had etched itself into the wing in a way that defied every explanation offered so far. He leaned in closer, noticing how the metal around the mark seemed slightly warped, not broken or punctured, but subtly softened, as though subjected to heat far more intense than what any cockpit flare or exhaust flash could create. Even more unsettling was the fact that the anomaly felt warmer than the surrounding metal, despite the coolness of the early morning air. He pressed his glove gently against it, half expecting to feel a spark or vibration, yet the surface remained still. His thoughts drifted back to the previous evening's patrol, trying to recall whether there had been any moment, a sudden flash, a pressure drop, a tremor, when something could have grazed the aircraft without his awareness. But the flight had been unremarkable. He had seen no enemy planes, detected no incoming tracers, and heard no warnings from his wingmen. If something had come this close to his aircraft, it had done so with a silence and precision that seemed almost impossible in the chaos of a war zone. As he stepped back to take in the whole wing, the early sunlight caught the burn pattern at just the right angle, revealing faint lines branching from the crescent's edge, like thin veins formed by uneven cooling. They were barely visible, but McKinley followed them with his eyes, tracing how they stretched outward in a delicate, web-like pattern before disappearing into the paint. These subtle details deepened his unease, for they implied not only intense heat, but also directionality, as though something had skimmed the wing while moving at tremendous speed. Behind him, the soft crackle of the ship's intercom announced the beginning of the morning briefing. Pilots drifted toward the ready room, their boots echoing lightly across the steel deck. McKinley remained still for a moment longer, absorbing one final impression of the strange sign before pulling himself away. As he walked toward the briefing room, he carried not just the memory of the mark, but also a growing certainty that it was the beginning of something. Not a malfunction, not a coincidence, but a clue, however small, that the Japanese air units were changing their methods. Inside the ready room, men spoke in muted tones as they settled into their seats. On the central map board, a cluster of symbols indicated areas where Japanese pilots had recently engaged American patrols. Reports suggested that the enemy pilots were confident, even dismissive, particularly when facing Hellcats. Several intercepted transmissions indicated that the Zero units believed they had identified predictable weaknesses in American climb profiles and turning patterns. What troubled McKinley was the possibility that this confidence was not baseless. The unusual scorch on his wing hinted at some form of reconnaissance or maneuver he had not recognized in the moment. As the briefing officer outlined the day's mission, McKinley sat quietly, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing against his thoughts. The ocean remained calm outside the thick steel walls. The engines throbbed steadily, and the ship prepared for another predictable patrol. Yet, deep within him, he sensed that the Japanese forces were preparing something new, something subtle, and something deadly. And whatever had brushed the wing of his Hellcat the night before would be the first silent sign of a battle neither side had yet realized was already beginning. The carrier eased steadily into its patrol corridor as the morning progressed, its engines producing a low, continuous vibration that seemed to merge with the ambient hum of the Pacific. In the ready room, the pilots were now reviewing diagrams of recent engagements, most of them centered on the widening confidence displayed by Japanese Zero units. For months, enemy pilots had relied on the Zero's superior climb rate and turning radius, mocking the Hellcat as heavy, sluggish, and incapable of matching their precision. Yet American intelligence had begun to detect subtle changes in Japanese flight behavior. Minor adjustments in their initial intercept patterns, tighter approach arcs, and what appeared to be a new emphasis on coordinated flanking maneuvers rather than individual duels. These details were easy to overlook, but for men like Lieutenant McKinley, already unsettled by the odd scorch mark on his wing. Such nuances carried a weight that others did not fully appreciate. As the briefing officer spoke, he tapped a thin wooden pointer against a chalk diagram, illustrating how Japanese pilots had recently attempted to exploit what they believed were blind zones in Hellcat forward visibility during banking transitions. The adjustment was small but deliberate, suggesting that the Japanese had gained access to American performance data or had observed enough encounters to identify new tactical openings. McKinley listened carefully, noting how these tweaks aligned with an incident report filed by another pilot 2 days earlier. That pilot had described a fleeting shadow that crossed his peripheral vision moments before a zero appeared precisely along his predicted blind angle. At the time, it seemed like coincidence, perhaps even an exaggeration born from combat stress. But the image resurfaced sharply in McKinley's mind now, merging uncomfortably with the burn on his wing and the soft, unnatural texture of the metal beneath that crescent arc. When the briefing concluded, the pilots moved toward their aircraft with the steady discipline of men accustomed to routine danger. McKinley walked alone for a moment, absorbing the cool morning air that rose gently from sea. The deck crew secured the last tie-downs and prepared the catapult system as he approached his Hellcat. The scorch mark, though small, seemed darker now beneath the rising sun, as if the metal retained a memory of whatever had struck it. The faint branching patterns appeared more defined, forming a fragile web that projected outward like the residue of rapid thermal stress. McKinley traced it briefly with the tip of his glove, sensing once more the subtle temperature difference that did not belong on a fighter left overnight in open air. As he climbed into the cockpit, he felt an unusual tightness in his chest. Not fear, but a quiet intuition that the day's patrol would not unfold the way many expected. The engine roared to life with a deep, resonant thrum, sending gentle vibrations through the control column. McKinley checked his instruments methodically, oil pressure stable, fuel gauge aligned, altimeter calibrated, and the magnetic compass steady. Yet something else tugged at his awareness, something beyond the limits of gauges and mechanical certainty. It was the notion that the Japanese pilot's confidence, and perhaps even their mockery of the Hellcat, was concealing a tactical evolution far more nuanced than simple bravado. Once airborne, the formation rose in a graceful arc above the carrier, their wings catching the sunlight in smooth, reflective sweeps. McKinley kept his position on the right flank, scanning the horizon while listening to the routine chatter across the radio channel. The Pacific stretched out beneath them in vast, shifting plains of blue, interrupted only by faint streaks of foam drawn by distant currents. For several minutes, everything seemed ordinary. Yet as they continued toward their patrol vector, McKinley noticed a subtle deviation in the air pressure readings on his panel. It was small, barely perceptible, but it reminded him of a similar fluctuation recorded during his previous flight, roughly moments before the scorch mark had appeared. He surveyed the horizon carefully, but nothing broke the continuity of sky and sea. No contrails, no glints of sunlight reflecting off metal, no shadows drifting across the waves. And yet, somewhere in the quiet vastness around him, he sensed movement. Not physical, but tactical, as if the Japanese were adjusting their approach, shaping the battlefield with an intelligence that preceded their physical arrival. The patrol continued deeper into its route, and while the sky remained empty, McKinley could not shake the impression that the enemy was observing them, studying their pattern, waiting for a moment when confidence slipped into complacency. The burn mark on his wing, though silent and inert, seemed almost like a warning, one that only he had recognized. The patrol advanced steadily across the open expanse of the Pacific, the formation maintaining its disciplined spacing as the sun lifted higher through a soft, milky haze. The Hellcats flew with the calm precision expected of seasoned pilots, each man accustomed to the quiet stretches that often preceded sudden violence. Lieutenant McKinley held his position on the right wing, adjusting his altitude by small degrees while observing the faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of air just above the horizon. It was a phenomenon he had noticed once before, an odd distortion, like the heat mirage of an inland desert, but appearing here over the open ocean where no such conditions should exist. It flickered briefly and then faded, leaving behind only the endless blue. He carried the image with him as the patrol shifted toward the second segment of its flight path, sweeping across waters where Japanese Zeros had been reported probing the edges of American airspace. Their tactics had grown bolder in recent weeks. Intercepts were no longer random. They appeared timed, coordinated, and sharply executed. Reports described Zero units approaching in shallow arcs from unexpected bearings, testing American reaction times, slipping into blind spots, and retreating before direct engagement. These encounters, though brief, revealed a quiet recalibration of Japanese strategy, one that suggested more study and observation than mere instinct. And the way the scorch mark had appeared on McKinley's Hellcat, without noise, without tremor, without warning, seemed to echo the same eerie subtlety. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from the lead pilot, but most of the channel remained silent. The routine calm usually brought reassurance, yet McKinley felt something else, a quiet, pressing tension, like the withholding of breath before an unexpected surge. He glanced again at the right wing, the section he could see from the cockpit, though the burn itself was positioned too far back to view during flight. Even without seeing it, he felt its presence. The mark had become a subconscious weight, a reminder that something had crossed his aircraft's path, undetected by both man and machine. At one point, the formation passed over a series of faint circular patterns on the ocean's surface. Wide rings, almost perfectly shaped, dispersing outward in slow, uniform ripples. The lead pilot commented on them briefly, noting that they resembled the aftermath of a torpedo test or the dispersal rings left by a sinking object. Yet there were no bubbles, no debris, no disturbance of any kind. McKinley watched the rings dissolve gradually behind them, the symmetry of the pattern lingering in his mind far longer than he expected. He could not explain why it unsettled him, but something about their precision seemed unnatural, as though created by a force whose motion had been too smooth, too controlled. Minutes later, another subtle shift drew his attention. His air pressure gauge dipped by a margin so slight that most pilots would have ignored it, but McKinley recognized the same fluctuation from his previous flight, the one that preceded the burn appearing on his wing. The needle trembled, held steady for a breath, then returned to its normal alignment. He waited for a second, more pronounced variation, but none came. The sky around him remained an undisturbed canvas of pale blue. Still, the moment tightened something in his chest. The lead aircraft signaled the beginning of a wide banking turn, repositioning for a sweep toward the western edge of their patrol corridor. As McKinley followed the maneuver, he scanned the quadrant where the shimmer had appeared earlier. The air looked ordinary now, free of distortion or shadow. Yet the sense of being observed grew stronger, not in a physical or visual way, but in the uncanny impression that their patrol route had been anticipated. The Japanese Zeros were known for bold entry angles and aggressive ascents, yet their new tactics, quiet, probing, unannounced, reflected a shift toward calculated patience. They were learning, adapting, applying pressure without firing a shot. And if the strange crescent mark on McKinley's wing was connected to their evolving strategy, then the enemy had discovered a method of approaching closer than American pilots believed possible. As the Hellcats leveled out, the radio remained silent, but the unspoken tension tightened between the aircraft. The ocean below appeared serene, but the air above carried the unmistakable impression of imminent contact. McKinley adjusted his grip on the control column, feeling the subtle vibration of the engine beneath his hands. The patrol was not yet under attack, but everything in his instincts told him that the first move had already been made, quietly, invisibly, from a distance too close for comfort. The patrol reached its farthest point west just as the sun began its slow drift toward the later hours of the morning, softening the horizon with a muted glow that made distances harder to judge. The air thinned slightly at altitude, creating a faint shimmering effect along the upper layers of the sky, and the formation tightened instinctively as they entered the sector where recent Japanese reconnaissance flights had been reported. Lieutenant McKinley remained alert, scanning the spaces between aircraft, watching for any deviation in light or movement. The memory of the scorch on his wing clung to his awareness like a thread that refused to break, guiding his focus toward the smallest irregularities. The lead pilot signaled for a gradual descent to sweep a lower band of airspace. As the Hellcats dipped, McKinley noted a subtle, elongated shadow sliding across the ocean's surface far below. It stretched in a thin, wavering line, moving contrary to the wind, then vanished abruptly as though swallowed by a deeper current of air. He hesitated before reporting it, unsure whether it was the residue of cloud reflection or something more deliberate. Before he could decide, the radio emitted a brief crackle, a static pulse not unlike the one he had heard on the previous day, but this time followed by a thin, nearly inaudible tone that lasted less than a heartbeat. The formation shifted slightly. Every pilot felt the change, though none spoke. The tone was too soft to classify, too brief to log, yet its very presence distinguished it from the randomness of atmospheric interference. McKinley tightened his grip on the controls. He scanned the sky ahead, and for a fraction of a second, a moment so fleeting that he questioned it immediately, he saw a faint glimmer high above the formation, a small reflective flash that cut sharply across the haze before disappearing. It was not sunlight catching the wing of a friendly aircraft. It was angled, deliberate, almost like a signal. Moments later, the lead pilot announced a radar anomaly, a faint but consistent contact appearing intermittently along their port side. The echo was small, irregular, and moved in a pattern too controlled to be a drifting balloon or stray seabird. It tracked their speed, sometimes closing the gap, sometimes widening it by subtle increments, as though testing reactions. McKinley felt the now familiar shift in cabin pressure again, a slight downward tremor on his gauge that mirrored the earlier reading. His stomach tightened. The sky, however, remained empty. The Zero pilots were known for bold interceptions, often diving in fast arcs that left little time for adjustment, relying on agility and speed. But this approach, silent, probing, almost mathematical, suggested a shift toward a new method, one that exploited hesitation and uncertainty. It was not an attack. It was an evaluation. As the formation maintained their heading, the intermittent radar contact stabilized briefly. Then, as if responding to the attention, the echo curved inward, drawing a delicate arc before flattening into a straight line parallel to the Hellcats. McKinley kept his eyes fixed on the quadrant where he sensed the movement, but nothing pierced the haze. The air ahead remained a pale, uniform blue, unbroken by silhouette or motion. Then came the first unmistakable sign, a shadow, narrow, swift, and angled, crossed beneath McKinley's aircraft, so fast and so silent that it appeared as nothing more than a dark ribbon flashing through the water's reflection. He lifted his nose slightly, scanning with sharpened focus, and at that same instant, another pilot in the formation reported a faint glint above his canopy, an object moving against the sun's position, reflecting light from a direction that made no sense. But before anyone could track it, the radio erupted with a crisp, urgent warning. Zeros inbound. They had closed the distance without a single visual cue, emerging from the haze like figures stepping out of a curtain. Their formation was tighter than usual, their angles steeper, and their speed control unervingly precise. They were not diving recklessly or circling wildly. They were approaching with an eerie discipline, as if following a coordinated pattern they had rehearsed in secrecy. For the first time, McKinley understood the purpose of the scorch on his wing. The Japanese had been probing distances, testing approach vectors, mapping blind angles, and studying how close they could get without detection. The burn mark wasn't damage. It was the silent footprint of reconnaissance. Now, the results of their findings were rushing toward the formation. The battle was about to begin. The first Zero streaked into view with a sharp, cutting dive that sliced through the haze like a blade drawn from a sheath. Its wings glimmered briefly in the sun before it pulled upward into a tight, climbing arc, an aggressive maneuver the Japanese pilots had used countless times to flaunt their agility. But this time, something was different. Instead of the usual chaotic swirl of individual dogfights, the Zeros approached in a synchronized pattern, each aircraft adjusting its angle by degrees, so precise that the formation looked almost mechanical in its choreography. Lieutenant McKinley watched the movement unfold with a quiet dread, understanding now that the enemy had refined its tactics far beyond the bold improvisations of the early war. The Hellcats tightened their defensive spacing. Engines roared through the high air, their collective vibration creating a low tremor that McKinley felt in the soles of his boots. As the Zeros closed in, he saw the same shimmering distortion he had noticed earlier. Thin, wavering threads of warped air drifting along their approach path. At first, he believed it was an illusion caused by the sun, but the distortion repeated, bending slightly around the lead Zero as though the aircraft were cutting through some unseen layer of atmosphere. The same effect had appeared on his wing days earlier, and a faint scorched shape flashed through his memory like a quiet warning. The first Zero fired a burst that cut across the formation in a clean, deliberate sweep. Tracers stitched the air between aircraft, passing so close to McKinley's canopy that he felt the heat of their passage. He rolled hard to the left, feeling the Hellcat's heavier frame respond with reassuring stability. The Japanese pilot attempted to follow with a rapid turn, but this time the tactic did not deliver its usual advantage. When the enemy banked sharply, his speed bled away faster than expected, giving McKinley the opening he needed. Without hesitation, he initiated the maneuver the Japanese pilots still believed Americans could never execute correctly. It was a move developed quietly, tested in late-night drills, and shared among pilots who understood its potential even before combat proved it. McKinley angled his Hellcat upward, then rolled gently across the opposing vector of a Zero's turn, creating a controlled weave that brought him out of the Japanese pilot's blind arc. The maneuver felt smooth, almost natural, and he sensed immediately that his position had shifted from vulnerable to advantageous. The Zero pilot, expecting the heavier Hellcat to overshoot or stall, pulled sharply into what he believed was an evasive advantage. But instead of losing ground, McKinley's aircraft slid directly into the Japanese fighter's firing cone. The Hellcat's heavier engine allowed him to maintain momentum through the turn, and in one steady motion he aligned his sights, not on the heart of the enemy aircraft, but slightly ahead, predicting the path the Japanese pilot thought was safe. A short burst left his guns. Tracers crossed the sky in a clean, disciplined line. The Zero shuddered. Its right wing dipped. Smoke trailed from beneath the canopy. The pilot attempted to climb, fighting to regain altitude, but the aircraft rolled into a downward spiral and disappeared into the haze. McKinley had no time to mark the victory. Two more Zeros descended from above, weaving in the same refined attack pattern as before. But the situation had shifted. The American pilots, sensing the flaw in the Japanese approach, began executing the new weaving tactic in coordinated pairs. The Hellcats moved with a rhythm the Japanese had not expected, rising in counter-arcs, crossing firing lines, and reversing angles with a stability the Zeros struggled to match. The Japanese pilots tried to adjust, but their new formation, so meticulously crafted, left them vulnerable to sudden shifts in speed. Their precision now betrayed them. And through the chaos, McKinley noted a final detail that made his stomach tighten. As 1-0 banked past him, a faint glimmer, almost identical to the burn pattern on his wing, flared briefly across its lower fuselage. It vanished instantly, but the implication was undeniable. The strange scorch was not unique to his aircraft. Something in the Japanese testing, perhaps an experimental observational instrument or aerodynamic method, had touched both sides of the conflict. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. The remaining Zeros broke formation and retreated into the haze, their disciplined pattern shattered by a maneuver they once believed impossible for a Hellcat to execute. For the first time, Japanese pilots understood that the aircraft they mocked had become a predator. The skies settled into a muted stillness after the last of the Zeros slipped back into the haze, leaving behind only the faint echoes of engines fading across the Pacific. The Hellcats regrouped slowly, their wings catching the soft light of the late morning as the formation tightened and turned for home. Lieutenant McKinley felt the familiar weight of adrenaline receding from his chest, replaced by a quiet, reflective heaviness that often followed combat. Yet beneath that calm lay an awareness that something far more significant than a single engagement had taken place. The Japanese pilots who once mocked the Hellcat had just encountered a tactic they were wholly unprepared for, and their reaction, breaking formation, abandoning the attack, retreating without the usual defiant flourish, revealed a shift deeper than any tactical report could fully capture. As the carrier came into view, its deck shimmering like a steel island rising from the sea, McKinley allowed himself a long, steady breath. The battle had proven the value of the weaving maneuver, but it had also exposed something else, something quieter and more mysterious. The scorch mark on his wing, its precise arc, its unusual heat, the faint branching patterns, was no longer merely a curiosity. The fleeting glimmer he had seen on the Zero, the strange pressure drops, the soft pulses on the radar, all suggested that both sides had been feeling the edges of an unseen boundary, a margin where new tactics brushed against the limits of what pilots believed possible. When the Hellcats landed, deck crews rushed to inspect the aircraft, their eyes widening at the sight of not only McKinley's scorch pattern, but also a nearly identical mark on another returning fighter. The discovery confirmed that the anomaly was not an isolated event. It had touched multiple aircraft during the same engagement, leaving signs that no bullet or exhaust could have created. Whether it represented a byproduct of high-speed maneuvers, an atmospheric distortion triggered by overlapping flight paths, or an unintended artifact of Japanese reconnaissance methods, no one could yet determine. But one truth emerged with clarity. The Japanese pilots had underestimated the Hellcat. They had misjudged its pilots. And in the moment their confidence collided with America's evolving air strategy, the balance of the sky shifted in a way neither side had fully anticipated. The burn mark might fade in time, but the change it symbolized would endure. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.